Okay, so in today's episode, we're going to take a look at the beginning of layers here. And it's going to be a few episodes dealing with layers here in the Mari non-commercial. If you haven't downloaded this asset here, it's on my Gumroad and it's for free. It's going to lead up into a project-specific tutorial next here after we have done all of the basics. I'm just going to here first take my initial Mari views here and just close them and focus here on layers and dock this layer here on the side. So I'm demoing this in Mari 7 now. So first off, I'm gonna import into this layer. So we can import from my course here. I'm gonna go here on one layer here. You can see here, this is a layer. We can select it. You can see this palette here. It means that it essentially is paint data. If I would hit this one here, you get a second layer and we can essentially start to paint here on top. If I would have something like color here, you can paint on top, and essentially in Photoshop style, you can just take this blending modes here if you want to change these, and you can start to fade the layers. Yeah, if you know Photoshop or layer texturing, this is gonna be very familiar. You can import into this layer. So let's name this here paint imported. Now we want to import into this layer, so we can take this one here and select the layer and right click and say this menu here essentially have a lot of layer operations that you might want to interact with. Some of them doubles here and also up here. So yeah, it's just another way to do it. I'm gonna import into current layer. I've already browsed here to the location, and in the course, if you download the course, you can get these projected EXR files that you can load into this asset. So I'm gonna point to this, import all patches, and this is what we get. So as you see here now, we have essentially the photo scan session imported into a specific layer. So we can see here what we want to do. We want to delete this base layer that was first created. So we already know about this one, the paint palette here. And let's go this one here, layer mask, for example. So a layer mask is a way to mask out paint on the layer. So to demonstrate this, if I hit tab here and just create color here, for example, this is a procedural layer and you can just choose one specific color. So let's take this, let's make it green. We know that green was one of the colors. Let's take this color here. And now we essentially want to mask out where this paint is going to be. So we have a color, but we want to define a mask. So this is where this add layer mask comes into handy. So if I hit this one here, you get an additional icon. And this one here is essentially telling us that we now have a layer mask here onto this layer. So it's an alpha mask, and at the moment it's flood filling with showing everything. If I want to, for example, here go in and select all of the patches, and I'm just gonna flood fill with black. You see here now essentially I've essentially taken away all of the paint here, and I can now start to reveal with my paint mask. If I paint white back, we're gonna then define where we're gonna see this paint here. So in my case, if I break this down, and now I can go in here and then adjust the underlying color independent of essentially the mask that we have there. And yeah, so that's kind of in the spirit of layer painting in Photoshop or something, that you have a layer mask onto a layer as well. And then next up here, let's take a look here. This is very similar to alpha channels or mask, this mask stack. So I'm just gonna take this one here and remove this one here. You can do that by going right clicking and then go to layer mask and say remove mask. Now it essentially removes the mask. And now let's go back here and say add mask stack and see what happens. So visually it's the same here essentially, except you see that it's kind of a little different icon there. And if I click this one here, let's dock it beneath here. Now we essentially have additional, we can now start to mask stuff here with different layers. So we can have essentially a mask that is in turn has layers. So let's demonstrate that by making a cloud. Now we see here we have a cloud. We can start to resize the size of the cloud, Maybe we want to tweak the look of this. So we might want to have sharper borders so that we can apply another layer here. So we can say brightness lookup, for example. So we can start to, with a curve, start to adjust here. You can see here. Now I'm essentially applying a contrast operation using a curve. So we can target where on this histogram, essentially, we want to have this transition, and this curve here is going to also define the look of this. And now I can go back here, change my cloud, essentially the look of it, go into my brightness lookup and do this to essentially tweak this. And then you can essentially also go in here. Okay, now I want to do some override, and you want to insert a paint on top, and now essentially paint back whatever you want on top. So you can essentially blend procedural and layers and paint the layers to define a mask that is more complex than just painting the mask. You can even, for example, have a ambient occlusion or something. Using the bakery, we can quickly here create an ambient occlusion that we can use as a geochannel inside here to demonstrate this even further. I'm just gonna go quickly here and bake, and then if you don't know how to bake, I have a few tutorials about bake as well, so you can link in the description. I'm just gonna bake an ambient occlusion from this object. I wanna bake it to GeoChannel, and let's bake it. There we go. And now let's go in here. I'm just gonna tweak this. So I wanna use a GeoChannel for ambient occlusion to tweak the look of this. So I'm just gonna do that now. I hit the tab and say GeoChannel, and now I'm gonna pick up my ambient occlusion, and we can see here how that looks. I'm gonna invert my ambient occlusion. So I hit tab and say invert, and then that creates a procedural layer with invert. And now let's make a tab brightness lookup, tweak the look of this. You get the drift, and now we can do the same as we did there. We can say where on this transition we want this to happen. You can look at this mask. You can see here now essentially we're seeing the result of the mask, but if you want to look at the mask, you have these modes here, out here, current layer and below. And now essentially inside this mask stack we can see the result of the mask, and you can see here this is essentially what we're doing here. We are applying a geochannel. We invert it, and then we apply a contrast operation on top of this, like so. So yeah, this is a way to check your workflow. If you want to see the mask as black and white, you can go to this one and say current layer and below if you're in the mask stack. So that's a bit about mask stacks. You can create essentially a layer mask that has layers inside it. So adjustment layer, that's another kind of like a procedural layer to, let's say we can go back to this one. I'm just gonna copy and paste this. So I just right click and say copy and paste. Now we wanna do an adjustment layer. So let's do a levels, for example. We want to level this paint, and now we can go in here. Okay, I want to tweak the look of this. I'm gonna do some grading here. Let's say that I want to crunch it or do something, and you can see here my levels is essentially like a filter on top of this, and we can use channel masks or alpha masks onto adjustment layers as well. So let's say that we want to use another way to apply an alpha layer or a mask. You can go here and select this adjustment layer, go to right click and say layer mask and add mask and hide all. That's something what I do. I either hide all or reveal all. So let's say that you want to mask in something small, then I use hide all, and essentially then go in and paint here. If I want to say that I want to do something here locally here in a small area, then I hide all and then paint white back. But if you want to just take away something, the opposite will be to go to layer mask and remove mask, and then say layer mask, add mask, and say reveal all. And now you will just essentially mask out what you don't want to be affected by this operation. It's up to you. It depends on if it's a lot you want to remove or if it's something small. So yeah, I'm gonna remove my levels here, and obviously here you have all kind of grades and gamma and contrast and color lookup. So this is more for grading localized areas of the underlying paint. Adjustment stack here is essentially similar to a mask stack that you can essentially do a bunch of operations on top of each other. So let's say that we want to have gamma, dock it. We want to do some localized stuff here. I'm gonna do a layer and paint out something, but then we want to have some other operations. Maybe we want to have a levels as well top of it, something like that. So now we essentially have a gamma, and then on top of that have a levels, and we can individually essentially tweak the look of these, add different masking. We might want to mask out this as well. We want to mask out something else here, like so. Going back here into my original painted data here, we now have this one as a adjustment stack here on top. Remove this one, adjustment stack, remove adjustment stack. Okay, so I right clicked and did that. Okay, so procedural layers here is next, and this is where we find a lot of the power in Mari to use procedural workflows. For example, here you saw how I used a color, and before then that's just a way to apply a single color that you can change after the fact, so you're not baking it down. A better example of a procedural layer will be like a 3-planar projection. So you can either go here and say projection and say 3-planar projection, and then you get this menu here, and we can just, if I hit the L button here and take one of these textures here and drag them into my slots here, and essentially here we can start to flood fill this asset with concrete here, and we can say world scale. It's gonna be the scale, and you can see here essentially now we can see a bit of the underlying texture here, and that because of the fall off here. So we can start to tweak how it's the fall off is applied here if you want to, or you can just import a color, constant color underneath here, and say black or something. And there, if I go look in flat shaded, we can see here I can go to world scale and set the scale of this texture. Can start to change the angle and what have you. So a lot of the power in Mari comes from using procedural workflow as much as possible, paint as little as possible, because then you can change a lot of your workflows. And usually what I do is to group my layers. For example, let's say that we want to apply this concrete on top of this paint here, but you might want to then start to add additional layers of custom procedurals and tweak them as one layer. And this is what I do. I select these two here, for example, right click and say group layers, and now we get a visual group here. You can say concrete, name this, and now you can essentially, you see here I can apply this on top. And now if you combine this with what we learned before with the layer mask, for example, let's say that we want to say layer mask, right click and say layer mask, add mask and hide all. And now we can go here and select certain parts. Let's say that like this base here, we want to apply concrete. And with this part selected here and the mask selected, I just drag here now white, and this now reveals concrete, whatever I have selected. And I can also now start to essentially paint the transition area here like so. And now we can, after the fact, as this is procedural data, we can now go in here and change the scale, for example, of this to see here after the fact. We can even now go in here and adjust here, make an adjustment layer and say HSV, maybe we need to grade this, saturate or grade it slightly towards a color, or desaturate it, or even change it. So yeah, this is definitely how you want to work. You want to isolate it into layer groups like this and paint as little as possible if you can. Yeah, so and grouping, you can either do it like I did before, or you can use this button here. So I usually just right click and do a lot of this operation from the right click menu, but there's a button for grouping here as well if you want to do that. Next up here we have graph layers, and it's a bit weird to use a new graph inside a layer stack, but yeah, there you go. You can do it. You can hit this button here and you get this graph layer, and essentially here when you click this icon here, you jumped into a node graph that just lives within this layer here. So now you can start here to essentially hook up stuff here. So let's start. I guess it can be a halfway house to a full working node graph workflow if you want to start to play with a node graph a bit but still be in the layer stack. Let's say that we want to recreate what we did before. We had a tile. We can now start to drag. We had the tree planar projection actually. Tree planar projection. Let's take this image, the same image with that we had before. So, and nothing here has happened yet because this node is just hanging here in midair. But you need to connect it to the output here. So let's do that. And now we can see here instantly, we now have the same behavior as when we applied the procedural tile tree planar projection, but using this graph layer. So you can get yourself familiar here with the graph workflow. So if you want to do the same as I did to add like a this constant color, let's say that you want to add the color and you want to have this under the tree planar projection, and we're going to make it black like so. You can now essentially merge this, type merge, so tab merge. You can have this in the base, the color, this one on over, and now we can plug this into the out instead. We can see here it popped there a bit. We're gonna look at node workflows a lot more in coming episodes, but yeah, so this is essentially a first glimpse into the node graph if you're working in layers. And now we essentially have here a contained node layer within this graph stack here. You can do other things here. Let's say that you want to do cloud or something, you want to grade something. It can be an HSV, it's a way to grade something, and you might want to localize it with the cloud. You can insert a merge here and again, merge. Let's see here, I'm just gonna zoom out here, take these away like so. Let's do value scale. So I'm using this HSV to take the value, and then we can use the cloud to further enhance this. For example, I'm going to do this large scale override on top of the concrete. So now we have a node graph within this layer here. And obviously we can now also go in back here and say we want to essentially have a layer mask and do layer operations here on top like we could do normally. Let's say that we want to take these faces here, take black here and fill black here. So now we have our concrete that is derived from this layer graph here and it's masked in, and it's all in the layer stack or the layer approach here, but we're still using nodes here. Okay, so the next icon here after the graph layers is duplicate layers. So that's, I guess it's what it does. You see here, I selected this layer and it duplicated, so just created a new one there. So yeah, here we go. And in the same fashion here, we can also remove layers here. You can see here, remove layers. What I usually do is just to select it and hit the delete button, but you can also hit this button. So this one here is using materials. Let's take a look at materials. So Mari ships here with some demo examples or some basic materials. So let's take a look. Let's say we want to add some mud, but this is a complete material and we can look at that more in depth here and see what happens. So mud, dirt, and you can see here the icon starts to look a bit different here. It essentially looks like a shading ball, and this is actually applying like a complete material on top of this asset, but it's also applying it in the, if you look here, what different streams I have. I have a color, specular, roughness, and bump, and it's all applying in them essentially as a material. So you can here start to tweak the repeat of this material, rotation. You can do some basic grading here. If I look through my shader, and we can see here, this material is essentially having base color, specular roughness, and the bump here, I can now start to paint in where I want to use this material using mask, for example. So I could essentially say add a lay mask, hide all. I want to now start to paint in the areas where I want to have this dirt on top of this asset, for example. We can go in here and change the properties, can grade it, we can do some tweaking of the HSV component, and all of this is driven by these materials that you can find in the shelf here. So, and you can define your own materials as well, something we're gonna look into further. If I go here to my Mari and say materials, these are the materials that is picked up, at least in the non-commercial. This is what ships. If you have other vendors or your own materials, you can create them and add them to your shelf, and they will also be able to pick up using this same method. Let's add another material, green metal rust. That's almost the material we have there. And now we can say, okay, I want to have my green metal rust. I want to have that on top. Let's remove this one temporarily. And let's say here, we want to now essentially apply a material, and we want to use this, the imported paint, as a guide. Lay mask, add, remove all, hide all, like so. And now let's essentially paint in some here. I want to tweak this material, so it's kind of a bit similar. Imported paint in the value there. And now I'm just gonna select this entire geometry here and now flood filled with white, and we essentially have a complete material with both the paint, the colors, the roughness, and bump here in one go. And we can now also go in here and tweak this, how much is tiled, like so, and we can continue to work on this further. And now we can obviously start to add more or less of this paint here. So yeah, this is material workflow, and we will dive a lot more into material workflows down the line as well. Let's take a look at this grouping here as well and see what we can do with that. So essentially here, if I go and select these two here, this is two materials, and we can now go here and group them. And we can see here it's essentially in the same fashion that I grouped these individual paint layers and treat them as one. We can now essentially also group materials and then tweak them as essentially a combined entity here. So let's see here, if I go to my mud, and I am just gonna essentially tweak in my mud here a bit on top of this material, and now I want to mask these two at the same time. I'm just gonna tweak the look here a bit more like so. And now we want to apply this as its own material, essentially, that has both the metal rust and the mud, and we want to call this metal mud. And we can now apply another lay mask, hide all. Now we can start to paint in this combined material here where we want to have this. We still have the option here to go in on my individual base materials here and tweak the look and do whatever we want to these two, but they are all essentially grouped under a top group that we then can mask or do additional stuff to here as well. So this can be very powerful, and this one leads into more possibilities down the line when we take a look at the material workflow. So before we wrap this very long tutorial, let's take a look at this one here as well. And this is mainly for housekeeping purposes. Let's say that you want to color code something here. You want to remember that this is important blue, or this aquamarine blue is something special, and maybe this one is like reference. Anything that's red, maybe it's reference, etc.